In today's episode,
I know you, Kerry, have spent a lot of time on this issue of abortion, and some people say, well, why do we need to talk about this?
so aside from being able to tell libertarians, hey, this is a pro-life philosophy, like I want to speak to conventional pro-lifers and say, look, the complicated nature of this is necessary to understand if we are going to actually end the practice of abortion. We don't want to be looking at this through a myopic lens.
I think it's impossible to separate abortion from the idea that people just want to be able to do whatever they want to do, and that fallen humanity is just inherently materialist.
Not wanting to be pregnant is a completely legitimate preference. The question is, how do you deal with that? Our society has, by and large, told women the thing that makes them women, which is the capacity to make babies, is actually a very real problem for them. Feminists talk about women as though they're victims of nature.
Would there be any place for laws against abortion? There are laws against murder.
As far as enforcement, that's another place where I'm quite a bit nuanced. Our criminal justice system doesn't do what it says it's supposed to do, and it also doesn't actually seek restitution for the victim.
Join me, Kerry Baldwin, with Presbycast as we Reformed Christians dare to think about a libertarian view of abortion.
A lot of people have never really thought about issues of liberty, government, intrusion into their lives. What's the state of the liberty movement and the principles of liberty and their place in the conversation and people's thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that the Overton window has definitely shifted. I think that there are more people who are contemplating these questions of freedom and the role of the state, civil governance, and how the church should respond to that. The liberty movement, I would say, is alive and well. We're hammering home the messages that we've been talking about for decades. Of course, I would say that the thing in the forefront of everybody's mind right now is probably inflation and monetary policy, what's happening economically. I've said before that I think that we have a prime opportunity to really make change towards liberty, and I'm optimistic.
Well, some people think, when they think of libertarians, they think of nerds on the spectrum who just want to be able to take drugs, legalize marijuana, do anything they want, and
not that there's anything wrong with that.
Well, says you, Wresby. But
we're pot smokers who know economics.
Oh,
just
okay.
Kidding.
Well,
just kidding.
Well, and the economic angle is harder to understand than, my kids can't go to school or I have to get this shot.
Right.
But, explaining how we got to the economic state that we're in now is more difficult than those other issues, but it's all together. The party, the Libertarian Party, is not the same Libertarian Party it was 4, 6, 8, 10, 20 years ago. It seems to have been taken over by the Mises Caucus. That would mean something to some people and not anything to others. So you want to say a couple of things about that, and what effect that might have on the next couple of election cycles.
Yeah, well, if anybody in your audience remembers the the presidential campaigns of Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, that's Mises Caucus.
I should interject. That caucus is named after Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist.
And I suppose another little bit of information that's valuable is that the Libertarian Party has always been sort of split between what you might call pragmatists and idealists. And the Ron Paul people, or the Mises Caucus people, are much more idealistic, much more honed in on the philosophy of libertarianism and sticking to those principles as consistently as possible. While the pragmatist side, they're the ones who've really held power for quite a while. The pragmatist side is more interested in just trying to play the political game. And if they have to sacrifice some principles, then so be it. So what happened this year at the Libertarian Party convention was, well, two major things, I would say. First of all, the Mises Caucus did successfully take over the party. They occupy every single elected seat in the National Party. And then the other major thing that they did was they removed the abortion plank from their platform, which is very significant. I have an article. It's pinned to my Twitter profile. It's also on the Libertarian Christian Institute, but it basically goes through the history of the abortion plank. The idea that libertarians have always been pro-choice is not actually true. And if you go through and you read the history of that plank, you'll begin to see why. But basically, they were trying to figure out how to reconcile women's rights with children's rights. And so there was seemed constant for a political party back and forth with that. And eventually this year, they voted to just remove it altogether because there have always been pro-life libertarians, whether in the party or just in principle. They've had a reasonable argument against abortion from a libertarian perspective. So that abortion plank was actually creating a lot of division within the party for pro-lifers in particular. And there was a lot of liberty-loving people who might otherwise really vote for a libertarian or run as a libertarian or get involved as a libertarian if it weren't for that blank. So those were the two major things that happened with the LP this year.
Before we get into the abortion issue, give your elevator speech for why Christians can or should take a look at, again, maybe not joining a party, because there are a lot of small L libertarians that don't like the large L Libertarian Party.
Yep.
But why should they take a look at the libertarians? What's the benefit to Christians, and are the principles of liberty compatible with Christian convictions?
The basic principles of libertarianism are two basic principles. One is the principle of self-ownership, which is the idea that you own yourself. And of course, there are Christians who would rebuff that idea because there's a scripture in the Bible that says you are not your own, you are bought with a price. So in response to that, I would say as a Christian libertarian that God absolutely owns me and owns everybody else. So in relation to God, I'm only a self-steward. He gives us a stewardship or a responsibility over our body and over our lives. In relation to others, we own ourselves. In other words, nobody else has a higher claim on our body or life than somebody else. And what that means for liberty, that goes into the next principle, which is the non-aggression principle. And that says that you may not initiate aggression or coercion against another person or their property. And so that's called the non-aggression principle. And the only legitimate use of force would be in self-defense, in response to an act of aggression. What this means for Christians is you don't have somebody else telling you, when you can go to church, or if you have to wear a mask, or how to educate your children, or, any number of things that the state actually tries to compel, coerce, or tell you what to do otherwise. So there's a great deal of freedom in that, and liberty is most definitely a theme in Christianity. I would say that
it's an underrated theme. Because, it's held up as the goal, for the children of Israel in the Old Testament. But almost any time freedom and liberty are mentioned in the Bible or implied, it's in a very positive, framework. And, really it's slavery to sin, or to, unjust rulers, or to some conquering power. That's always presented, that's the opposite of freedom and liberty. And that's always, when it's between people, when it's between persons or groups or nations, a subjugation is never extolled. It's always the result of sin or evil, or some, combination of the two.
Yeah, well, one of the founding principles, you might say, of classical liberalism was religious freedom, which started in the Protestant Reformation. This is very much in our own history as Reformed Christians. And yes, the Bible speaks quite a bit about liberty and freedom of conscience, and even that idea that we are slaves to Christ. It is to say that we are free in Christ, right? By being a slave to Christ, he frees us from the yoke of sin and slavery and so forth. Yeah, I think that there are very good reasons why Christians can be libertarians. And I'll go ahead and plug our book. I'm a co-author with some of my colleagues from LCI on a book called Faith Seeking Freedom, Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. We answer 101 tough questions that we get asked as Christian libertarians. And this is everything from what does the Bible say about civil governance and resistance to topical issues like ethics and abortion and environmentalism and war and the whole gamut. So you can find it on Amazon. It's a super easy read.
It seems like today that some progressive evangelicals, they've never met an expansion of government or a large program or a government mandate that they don't like. Mm-hmm. And it hit me sometime in the last couple of years that you can advocating for liberty, general liberty for people, is or can be a form of loving your neighbor. Mm-hmm. But it's possible to advocate generally for liberty and adopt some of these principles and do it out of love for neighbor, and it actually have good effects for your neighbor.
Yeah, well, the role of civil governance has to do with legal coercion. What are we saying that the civil magistrate can actually use force in enforcing? So when somebody says, and this happens on the right and the left, but when somebody says there should be a law, what we're saying is a government agent should use force against you or threaten to put you in a cage if you don't do what I think you should do. That's fundamentally what that's about. There are Christians on the left and the right who have no problem using the state against liberty. I would say that both sides err in trying to get the state or civil governance to fulfill the two greatest commandments, right? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So the right tries to compel love of God through law, through certain laws, not all laws, and the left tends to compel love of neighbor through the law. And I think it's absolutely true what you say, Wresby, Chortles.
No. If it was something good, attribute it to me.
I do think it is loving to give people the freedom of choice. And just because there's a freedom to make a choice doesn't mean that, you're going to make the right choice. And it doesn't mean that giving that choice means that you endorse the wrong choice, right? Mm-hmm. But certainly giving that freedom to choose is a loving thing. I mean, God gave Adam and Eve the choice in the garden, and they chose poorly. But we can't say that giving the freedom of choice is a bad thing, because that would create a problem for Scripture.
Well, I think we mentioned it long ago, and the choice in how we love our neighbor is and I think the power of the "Who's my neighbor" parable is the fact that we're constantly looking way too far in the distance for who our neighbor is, and we're still missing the people who are in our homes who need that as well. And so when Scripture talks about woe to the man who sells everything to donate it at the expense of his own family, I think we saw people forcing other people to do that very thing. Is you have to give all of this up, even if it hurts your family, for just the idea of, rather than the actual thing. And that's why I think those, the Biden memes of like, hey man, I can't feed my family, and he's like, sorry, Jack. Like, it's absurd. But it nails the point, is when we lose who our neighbor is. And I think, and again, like I said, the reason why those parables speak so powerfully is because we're always confusing who our neighbor is.
Right.
All right, so we've covered some of the basic things. I know you've, Kerry, have spent a lot of time on this issue of abortion, and some people say, well, why do we need to talk about this? Because the Bible says we shouldn't murder, and in a few places it actually mentions not by using the word abortion, but the killing of an unborn child. And, that's wrong and you shouldn't do it. Certainly the early Christians supposedly were known for saving exposed infants and taking in orphans. And that's always been part of our conviction. But you've done a lot of work on this. But some people would say, well, why? Well, tell us why you have done it.
In 2019, I had put out a couple of podcast episodes just talking about a libertarian view of abortion and applying these principles of self-ownership and non-aggression to pregnancy, reproductive rights, that sort of thing. So I was invited by the Soho Forum, which is a libertarian organization. They're sponsored by Reason Magazine. I was invited by them to go out to New York City and debate a PhD economist by the name of Walter Block. And Walter Block he's basically the guy to beat on this topic. He's had his theory of what's called evictionism since about 1977. So there's a few reasons why I'm doing this research and trying to articulate a pro-life libertarian theory of abortion and more broadly reproductive rights. Number one, I genuinely believe that libertarian philosophy is necessarily pro-life. And when I say necessarily pro-life, when we talk about the principle of self-ownership, we're talking about something that is inherent in humanity. And if it's inherent in humanity and not given to us by anybody else, then it's got to have a starting point. We need to be able to establish that. And so far, we haven't established that, not just within libertarianism, but human rights theories, broadly speaking. So that was number one. But number two, I really wanted to speak to the pro-life movement, what I call the conventional pro-life movement, because with the moral argument, we know that we've got the moral high ground on this, which basically says, look, since abortion is murder, then we simply outlaw abortion as thoroughly as possible. And that's the solution to the problem. And in all of the politics and the rhetoric and the activism and so forth, we talk about ending abortion now or abolishing abortion, or this idea that we can eliminate it somehow from society. Certainly, I think that's the goal. But what I'm focusing on is sort of a different set of questions. On the libertarian side, we're asking this question, how do we actually account for why abortion is murder, right? It's one thing to say, well, that's a human being and you're killing it. Like, yes, we agree with that. But if you look at most of the pro-life legislation out there right now, even these trigger bans that have gone into effect since the overturn of Roe, those bans don't start until the heartbeat. That's essentially an arbitrary starting point. Is that a good way to actually judge whether or not that's a human life? So this question, how do we actually account for why abortion is murder, is a question that pro-lifers, conventional pro-lifers, really haven't grappled with a whole lot. It's always been the moral argument. It's always been sort of reactive to the pro-choice side. And we need a legal theory in order to parse that out and really say where, rights are for the woman and rights are for the fetus and what are they and that sort of thing. So that's one question that I'm answering with this theory. The other side of that coin, though, the end abortion or abolish abortion now sort of sentiment, the other side of that coin is how do you end the practice of abortion? And there's a great deal of disagreement about this question of ending the practice of abortion. There are some pro-lifers who acknowledge that criminalizing it won't end it, but that's okay. We're just going to throw them in prison and be done with it, whoever it is, just the abortion doctor or the woman, and even that's a question, right? And that's something that a legal theory needs to parse out as well. But in libertarian theory, we have the economic element. That is dealing with something called praxeology, which is the study of human action. This is something that actually, if we use it, if we leverage it, we can answer questions about why women seek abortions to begin with and respond to it in economic ways that persuade women to not seek out abortion to begin with, to voluntarily choose life.
Which is what, some of the pro-life movement does now. with crisis pregnancy centers, adoption assistance, economic support, all those things.
Yeah, and crisis pregnancy centers are absolutely wonderful. I'm a huge advocate of them. They have sort of, in the past 50 years, they've been that piece of the puzzle, though, that has mitigated this sort of practical question: how do we end the practice of abortion? It's mitigated that in the broader conversation, because the broader conversation has always been centered around legality and Roe v. Wade and what does the court say. But now what we're going to find with the overturn of Roe, we are already seeing this, is the economic aspect, the black market or gray markets. What do you do for a woman who's traveling out of state to go get an abortion legally in a different state? All of those questions are economic questions. That is where a lot of my work has been one on the legal rights question. What are the rights? What are the rights of the woman? What are the rights of the fetus? And then how does economics and praxeology actually give us information about how to encourage women to voluntarily choose life? And then the third piece is the enforcement question, which is actually, if you're going to have abortion prohibition, you have to have enforcement of that. And I would say that where there are disputes between pro-choicers and pro-lifers, it has largely to do with how it's going to be enforced. So that's another piece of the puzzle. So, aside from being able to tell libertarians, hey, this is a pro-life philosophy, like necessarily, but I want to speak to conventional pro-lifers and say, look, the complicated nature of this is necessary to understand if we are going to actually end as much as possible the practice of abortion. We don't want to be looking at this through a myopic lens.
All right. So, what are your arguments? I mean, do they hinge on the libertarian idea of property or self-ownership? You might want to explain the traditional libertarian position that was, informed by the idea of evictionism, which meant they basically portrayed the unborn child as a squatter and who could be evicted by the landlord.
Yeah. It was Murray Rothbard who suggested that we use property rights to articulate human rights. So when we talk about property rights, we're still talking about a human right. If I go exchange money for groceries, that food is mine. That's a human right. When we talk about self-ownership, we're still talking about a property right. It's a property right in myself. It is the quintessential property right. My argument has to do with something I call fetal self-ownership. So it's applying this principle of self-ownership to the fetus and saying, when does the fetus become a rights-bearing individual? When does the fetus become a self-owner? Now, what Walter Block did was to say, well, if I have a house, right, and there's somebody else inside my house and I don't want them there, then I have the right to kick them out. I have the right to evict them, right? But I don't have a right to kill them. And so he basically took that analogy and he applied it to the situation with the womb. If libertarians are one thing, they are staunch advocates of bodily autonomy and agency, and so am I, quite frankly. So what I do with the argument is I argue that a fetus meets the conditions for self-ownership from the moment conception is complete. It's at that point, scientifically, that a fetus is autonomous and self-organizing. Its whole development is self-driven from the moment conception is complete. That's roughly 3 days after fertilization. So it's not quite this moment of conception. We have new information. It doesn't take place in a moment. So I'm looking for the two conditions for self-ownership, which is one, you have to be a human. And two, you have to have possession of yourself or direct and immediate control over yourself. It's at that point at conception that now development is driven by the genetic instructions of the embryo.
Yeah, well, and just being, I think common sense tells us that simply being dependent on someone else doesn't mean that you lose your rights.
Right.
If that were the case, everyone on life support, we would just unplug them I mean,
Yeah.
it's a mirror image almost.
Yeah, every single argument that has been used to claim that the fetus either doesn't have rights or has lesser rights than the woman, if you were to apply any of those arguments to born humans, then you suddenly get all of these marginalized groups in society that have had their rights violated before. So it's interesting that the fetus is actually representative in some fashion of all of mankind, because it can be disabled, it can be female, it can be black, it can be white, it can be, all of the reasons that have been used to discriminate against somebody and violate their rights. The fetus in some way represents that. One thing that I think we haven't done, not just libertarians, but philosophers generally, when it comes to a theory of human rights, is we tend to think about human rights in terms of man's rights, like man qua man. And that's sort of your generic rights. And then we try to apply that to women and offspring, and it doesn't quite work. What I'm suggesting is if we actually pay attention to mankind qua woman, right, and mankind qua offspring, then we can get a clearer picture of what human rights are. Because if we're really honest with ourselves, none of the theories of human rights right now are consistent, because they do not account for the rights of women and children. And these, by the way, happen to be the two groups that the state is ready and willing to exploit in a crisis, is women and children. And so it really is a necessity for us to have a comprehensive theory of human rights that reconciles the rights between man, woman, and offspring.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Dare to Think. I'm Kerry Baldwin, and I'm an independent researcher with a degree in philosophy. My mission is to rethink prevailing paradigms in politics, religion, and culture. Please consider subscribing to Dare to Think on your favorite podcatcher. Also, please go rate and review Dare to Think on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or Amazon. This will help others find my podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on my latest articles and episodes, please subscribe to my monthly email list at mereliberty.com/signup.
I think it's impossible to separate abortion from the idea that people just want to be able to do whatever they want to do, and that fallen humanity is just inherently materialist. We want things and we want them now. So does your argument have anything to say to them?
Well, I would say this is where the praxeology part comes in, because, I'm not a materialist, and libertarianism isn't a materialist philosophy. But when we look at what people want, we're looking at preferences, and that's a legitimate thing. One thing that I say is that unplanned pregnancy is not a moral failure, and it's also not a natural failure, as in, you're a victim of nature because you got pregnant and didn't plan on it. Not wanting to be pregnant is a completely legitimate preference. The question at hand is, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with an unwanted pregnancy or a crisis pregnancy? Our society has, by and large, told women the thing that makes them women, which is the capacity to make babies, is actually a very real problem for them. Feminists talk about women as though they're victims of nature. And I'm not the only one who says this. There are several feminists out there that are now speaking against that idea that the women are victims of nature. When a woman gets pregnant, they carry the greater cost of the pregnancy. And so the fact that a woman would not want to carry that cost, whatever it is, could be financial, could be health, could be relational if you're in a bad relationship. A woman recognizing that isn't a bad thing. So from an economic perspective, what we want to have is options available to her, not just as alternatives to the unplanned pregnancy itself, although we do want that. And that's where, adoption agencies come in, crisis pregnancy centers come in, and that sort of thing. But her decision-making process actually starts way before that, way before she gets pregnant, way before she has sex, way before she gets into a relationship. There's not a lot of teaching women how to make these choices, how to make risk assessments, how to think about their future and that sort of thing. And yet they are making decisions intuitively towards that direction. I don't think that we need to really say, well, we need to fight these materialists or these people that want everything now. What we need to do is leverage the market. And the market is just the exchange of goods and services between individuals.
So would you propose, you're talking about education, I guess, but would that be done by the state, or would that be done by independent? Yeah. So anyone listening to you might think, well, this just sounds like we need government programs.
I don't think it should be, and libertarians would say this, that it shouldn't be coerced by the state. It shouldn't be planned by the state. When the state gets involved, they muck it up. The government isn't involved in education. The government isn't involved in economic regulation. The government's sole purpose is to adjudicate disputes and to administer restitution when rights violations are made. Now, when I talk about education, I'm talking about obtaining knowledge. So what that means as far as, programs or responses on a societal level, that's all economic in the sense of, maybe you have a nonprofit organization that works closely with a crisis pregnancy center, for example, a private organization that comes up with a curriculum that private schools can use, that homeschoolers can use, that, whomever. And that's not the only organization. That organization is going to compete with other organizations who have their ideas about how to respond to that, how to answer those questions. A woman learning that she has agency over her body and she has control over her body, and that she's responsible for her body, that's a great deal of power. But if you don't teach her how to use that and make good decisions, then that becomes her greatest vulnerability. And what you see in the conventional abortion debate is both sides look at women as victims. You're either a victim of nature or she's a victim of circumstance, or it sort of undermines any of the choices that she had that might have prevented, the poverty or the bad relationship or whatnot. And so she needs somebody else to make decisions for her or for women in general. Instead, we should be talking about the woman learning how, or the teenage girl learning how to make decisions about her body so that she can, as much as she can, mitigate those things.
I assume you would say that the religious teachings of abstinence and prioritizing marriage and family are the best way to prevent abortion or the need for it.
So, yeah, I actually think that if we follow the praxeology through to its logical conclusion, then we have an argument from nature, essentially, that marriage is the best situation to be in if you're going to get pregnant and have babies. So yes, there's the religious argument. And of course, I affirm that. But just following out the logic through to its logical conclusion, I think we actually see why that's true. I'm hoping to parse that out in the paper that I submit. The same thing with abstinence only. I think the only sort of caveat that I would make to that is that people in general need to have a conversation about sex, because not having a conversation about sex can actually lead to a number of abuses, and people who are vulnerable don't even realize that they've wound up in an abusive situation because they didn't have those conversations. By having the conversation about sex, we can also introduce risk assessment into that conversation. We can say, okay, this is something you want to do. Can you afford to do this? And help young people ask those questions about themselves. A teenage boy and a teenage girl who have hormones raging, right, end up having sex, and then she gets pregnant and he's shocked and he wants to keep the baby and she doesn't. Well, he's just lost out because he's not married to her. So why are we not having this conversation about risk assessment? We aren't having those conversations. We aren't saying let's talk about risk, let's talk about trade-offs, let's talk about these other things. Oh, it turns out that being in a committed relationship having some sort of legally binding contract, those sorts of things assure, and they're protective of both father and mother. So that's a conversation that should be had. I think it's not had enough. So yes, I'm absolutely an advocate of a Christian sexual ethic, but having that conversation as to why is very, very important. You will inevitably have organizations that are more pro-choice or pro-abortion and some that are pro-life, anti-abortion. And so you would have that competitive aspect, which is central to economics. But that competitive aspect is really important because the market, which is, you and me, we're responding to what's put out there. We're consuming it. We're the consumers. And when the government gets involved in that, when they get involved with regulation, they actually take our power away from us to regulate the market ourselves. In fact, women are the primary consumers in the economy, and there's a very good reason for that. And that has to do with the fact that we're the ones who are raising the next generation. So when we have the power to choose from a number of different options in the market, we send signals to those producers about what it is that we want. The argument from a libertarian perspective is that a freed market is going to maximize those things that are high quality and cost effective and ethical and life affirming. A dangerous medical procedure is not going to last very long in a market where there's 10 other procedures that do the same thing, but is more safe, right? So the idea here is not to get the government involved in regulating how that's going to work and saying, we want to have a culture that is abstinence only and holds marriage sacred and that sort of thing. And so these are the policies that we're going to implement. We've tried that. It doesn't work. It backfires. So by leaving it to the market, we're leaving it to a process that is inspired by innovation and competition. And like I said, maximizes the highest quality product or service at the lowest cost and is more ethical and life affirming, like that grows out of the innovation.
Would there be any place for laws against abortion? There
Sure.
are laws against murder. So I think a listener has a question about, so what would the legal strategy be?
Yeah, and I think one thing that this overturn of Roe is going to really bring to the surface is this distinction between legal and economic. So can a libertarian society, or would a libertarian society prohibit abortion as it's murder? Yes, that can happen. Absolutely. One of the things that is rising to the surface, though, right now is what is it exactly that you're banning or legally prohibiting? Is it the DNC procedure? Is it the abortion pill? Is there a prohibition against purchasing that? That's an economic regulation. And actually, the way the laws are written right now is a woman who obtains, say, mifepristone, which is one of the abortion pills. There are 2 abortion pills, but that's one of them. If she obtains that and she administers it herself, the way the laws are written is she's not going to be charged with murder. So, in a libertarian society, if we were implementing my theory as I'm describing it, the action of initiating aggression against the fetus would be legally prohibited, right? And that actually holds the woman responsible for having the abortion. This would exclude miscarriages. If you guys want to talk about that, we can. But what we're seeing right now is this attempt they're called bans, but they're really economic prohibitions, or you can't sell the service is really how that's working out.
So you're saying that the legal framework regime that you would propose would actually be more restrictive.
The distinction that I'm trying to make here is that in a libertarian society, it wouldn't be that a DNC or an abortion pill is banned. Those are procedures or products that are used for other things as well. I think mifepristone was used for like cancer or something like that, and the other drug, misoprostol, is used for ulcers. So they have other uses. So you wouldn't actually, in a libertarian society, those drugs wouldn't be banned. You could still get them. A woman could still, illegally take an abortion. When I say illegally, she's the act of ingesting those pills would be that act of murder, right? So I'm drawing that out because in a libertarian legal order, those goods and services wouldn't be legally prohibited. A DNC is used for delivering an already dead baby in certain miscarriage situations, where the woman's body doesn't expel the fetus. So in a libertarian legal order, what you're looking at is the action that the woman takes against her fetus, right? That's what would be legally prohibited. So in some sense, I would say it's a much more precise way of looking at the law that would be written. Before I get into the punitive aspect, does that answer the question as far as what would be criminalized?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Maybe someone was assuming that because, in a libertarian society, there just wouldn't be laws against anything, which is actually not true.
Not true. Yeah. The non-aggression principle is the basis from which we would identify rights violations, and rights violations would be considered illegal. As far as enforcement is concerned, that's another place where I'm quite a bit nuanced. The way that our system operates right now is it's a system of justice that is largely a product of tough on crime policies, war on drug policies. We have principles written into the Constitution that they're not really practiced anymore, not as strictly as they should be. And that has a lot to do with these policies that have come through as a consequence of the war on drugs and tough on crime policies, which I'll just say are totally a product of Joe Biden. So the idea with our current criminal system is if you commit a crime, what the state does is the state comes in and considers that crime as a crime against the state, not a crime against Chortles. Then you have all of these other possibilities, like if you get a conviction, these punishments are supposed to create a deterrence effect, which means, okay, if you know what the punishment's going to be, then that's going to deter you from committing the crime. And what we actually find, there was a study done in Canada, the United States, and Australia, looking at these tough on crime policies. And they actually found that it doesn't create a deterrence effect. It also doesn't reduce recidivism, which is repeat offenses. So, part of the other idea is somebody goes to jail for a crime, and when they get out, they should have learned their lesson so they never do that again. That doesn't actually bear out. People who get out of prison are just as likely to recommit that crime, and a lot of people end up doing that. So there's no deterrence effect, and there's no reduction in recidivism rates from our system. The other problem with our system is that it costs the victim. The victim doesn't actually get restitution. Any restitution is really just the state getting satisfaction in having a conviction. So the reason why I bring all of this
and funding the massive, court and prosecutorial system.
Yeah, the other component is that our criminal justice system, as it exists today, number one, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and number two, taxpayers are paying for that, and it's perpetually more and more expensive. So our criminal justice system doesn't do what it says it's supposed to do, and it costs taxpayers exorbitant amounts of money, and it also doesn't actually seek restitution for the victim. So lots of problems. I bring that up because in a libertarian legal order, there's really two, there might be more, but the two kinds of enforcement that I focus on are tort law and something called restorative justice. Tort law is something that we already use in civil courts. If you damage somebody's property, right, you can sue them civilly and get financial restitution. That's a tort. Then there's restorative justice, which, well, I can talk about in a minute. Both of those forms of enforcement actually produce deterrence when you know the cost of your crime, not the punishment of your crime, but when you know how much you're going to pay if you get caught. That actually does produce deterrence. And it also lowers recidivism rates. So that's something that we want. So I would say when it comes to punishment for abortion, for example, I don't advocate for the criminal justice system that we have. And that's really not, libertarians are looking for restitution when it comes to justice. So what I'm looking at is tort law and restorative justice, particularly restorative justice. This is a model which is really interesting. They use it in Longmont, Colorado. They've used it for the past 2 decades. What's interesting about restorative justice is that it encourages responsibility. It encourages the offending party, or the responsible party is what they call them, to take responsibility and actually provide restitution to the victim. And they use it in Longmont. They use it for violent crimes, and they've had great success. Their crime rates are super low, so they have a deterrence effect. They have a very low recidivism rate, and they don't destroy people's lives in the process. I look at these things and I say the 2 top reasons why women seek abortion are poverty and bad relationships. And that might be because they don't know how to balance a checkbook, or they haven't gotten themselves a good job, or they've gotten wrapped up in drug use, or whatever it is. Restorative justice is actually an opportunity to not only help them see the harm that they've caused in their action and take responsibility for it, but they're given an opportunity to actually make recompense, but also ensure that doesn't happen again. And the way the system works, the restorative justice system works in Longmont, Colorado, is it is outside the state apparatus. So you have police, you have courts, those still exist up there. But if there are certain conditions met, then you can take the restorative justice route. And that is a private organization that walks you through this process that they have. And that it's very successful. So when I think about enforcement for abortion, it would be one of those two, restorative justice or tort law.
Well, yeah, so someone asked, how would tort law apply when there's no economic harm or there's no damage to something that belongs to someone else?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's any number of ways that can sort of be calculated. One of the features of libertarianism is that the victim gets to have a say in, what they would consider restitution. And that can be, so maybe they're naming a price. Maybe this is a father who didn't want his wife to have an abortion. And, maybe he doesn't want monetary compensation. He wants her to make some sort of change. That's an opportunity for something else. The point is not to say, here's a dollar amount on fetal life, or here's a dollar amount on human life. Restorative justice is a good alternative to situations where somebody can't actually pay a monetary compensation. Restorative justice focuses a lot on maybe they can perform a service, or maybe they can, go to therapy, or maybe they can, any number of ways that they can go about providing restitution. But that's something that's worked out between the responsible party, the offender, and the victim.
All right. Well, that's this is another perspective. It's as you say, it's this is a long view, I think. In the meantime, are you one of those people who could not celebrate the overturn of Roe and condemned everyone who did, or were you actually happy that that law was overturned?
No, I'm happy that Roe was overturned. It needed to be overturned. It was bad, not just for the unborn, but for women as well. I'm a little bit skeptical about how it's going to play out as far as state level laws. I think that there is a bad way to go about enforcing abortion prohibition that can come back and bite us in the butt. So I'm cautious when it comes to that. But I do think that what we're looking at in America is going to be a split. You're going to have roughly half the states that ban abortion at some point. It's looking like 6 weeks. And then half the country is going to keep it legal and maybe even expand upon it. And it's going to create an interesting dynamic that I think can only be answered if we're willing to look at the economic aspects of this. And so my goal is end the practice of abortion, whether it's ending the legal practice of abortion or ending the voluntary practice of it in economic terms.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. You're realistically accepting that it's going to be legal in some states and that some of the things you've talked about could reduce it even then.
Yeah, in that book, Faith Seeking Freedom, I actually have in that chapter on abortion, I discuss a strategy for whether abortion is legal or not. So yes, absolutely. I think it's good to overturn Roe. Casey, Planned Parenthood versus Casey was also overturned. It's good to overturn those things. Those were bad case law, bad for the unborn, bad for women. But, at the state level, we need to be asking questions about enforcement. Are those enforcement measures going to create new injustices? Because the war on drugs certainly did, and these tough on crime policies don't work. So we need to be asking questions about that. And then asking questions about, are we really protecting the unborn by simply prohibiting essentially the sale of the service of abortion at 6 weeks and beyond? Is that really pro-life?
What would you want to say in summation, or where would you point people to learn more about?
I would say, first of all, it's a paradigm shift. Thinking about this in libertarian terms is a paradigm shift because we're accustomed to thinking about the state and civil governance and crime and punishment in particular ways.
And political party binaries.
Yes.
We have this policy, they have this policy.
Yeah.
That's all.
If you want to learn more about a libertarian view of abortion, you can find a myriad of articles, podcast episodes, interviews, and my Soho Forum debate directly on my website at mereliberty.com/abortion. If you like what you hear, please consider becoming a monthly member for as little as $5 a month. Please don't forget to leave a review of Dare to Think on Apple or YouTube, and follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Links are in the show notes.